Earthquake Safe Design and Construction Practices. This session is on the geotechnical earthquake engineering, which will be delivered to you by Dr. Amit Prashant Sir. Sir is a professor of civil engineering and dean of research and development at IIT Gandhinagar. He is currently the chairman of the Ahmedabad chapter of Indian Geotechnical Society and also member of the board of governors of SBNIT Surat. He completed his Bachelor's of Engineering degree from IIT Roorkee in 1997. After 2 years of consulting experience, he went for higher studies at Clarkson University, New York, and then uh, to the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. After completing his doctoral studies and 1 year of postdoctoral research, he worked at IIT Kanpur as assistant professor during 2005 to 2010 and then moved to IIT Gandhinagar in 2010. He has been actively involved in academic administration as chairman SUGC at IIT Kanpur earlier and for 6 years as Dean Academic Affairs at IIT Gandhinagar. With that experience, he was also appointed as officiating director of IIT Gandhinagar during July-September 2019. His research interests are in constitutive modeling of soils, earthquakes geotechnical engineering, and application of geosynthetics, which includes experimental investigations and numerical modeling. He has done field projects related to hill slopes, excavations, canals, ash dikes, bridge foundations, barrages, etc. He has conducted several industry courses in earthquake engineering, FPM, and geotechnical investigations, which have been quite popular. He is also coordinating a faculty development programs for last 6 years under the aegis of TEQIP scheme of Government of India for engineering colleges in the country. It's my honor to invite him for this session. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It is my pleasure to be here, and I hope you had very good sessions earlier, and I hope you get something to think about out of this presentation as well. Of course, there is nothing better than meeting all of you. I hope I will be able to meet all of you in near future. But right now, I think the best mode possible is online mode. So let us go with that. So today, Chaitanya asked me to talk about geotechnical earthquake engineering. And of course, 1.5 hour is can be only introduction to that. So you will see some overview of information, you can say, but key things that we should worry about in a way. Not so much of conceptual discussions, or you can say so much of theoretical, or you can say case studies kind of things, but I will touch upon most of the things that we should think about, we should worry about while looking into design aspects. So that is my focus for this introduction to geotechnical earthquake engineering. So as we know, seismic waves travel through soil media, rock first and then the local soil, and the fault can be rupture can be far away, and it travels through that soil strata and reaches to the structure that we are trying to make. That can be a building, bridge, or anything else. My guess is that this workshop is mainly focusing on buildings, so I will be mainly confining my discussions to mainly buildings only. So when it travels, there is a big aspect of seismic hazard analysis, site-specific response study, and so on. And the objective is really to find out what kind of waves we are going to receive at the ground surface where my building is going to be. Many times it is difficult to know that, and not so much of, you can say, site-specific studies performed in unless there is a major project of very big, you can say, investment. So in such cases, we depend on some codal provision, and I think most of you are aware of 1893. You may have heard about it in last couple of days many times. And how do you find those, you can say, zone factor and all those things, right? And so that you can have some, you can say, benchmark or idea about what kind of accelerations that you can expect in your area where your building is going to be. Now, of course, that is sometimes a conservative estimate, but sometimes it may not be. It is a ballpark estimate, you can say, that is we decide for the code for in general cases kind of thing, not too conservative, not unsafe either kind of thing. And then we add certain aspects of specific design issues of different components. So it can be building, it can be foundation, it can be something else that we are designing like slopes, etc. And they will have their own features, their own requirements, etc. And those are the things we are going to discuss today mainly. So we are not going to go into, you can say, investigation, soil investigation and hazard analysis and all those things. We'll focus on design aspects mainly. So, but overall picture will come only if you do all those components. That's what I wanted to point out to you, right? So if I understand soils first, it is better, I would say, for any design aspect. So what is the difficulty in you can say designing foundations many times? Of course, besides those variability of strata, heterogeneity, you can say, it varies from point to point, and it is difficult to know what soil is going to be where kind of thing unless you do very thorough investigation or geotechnical investigation. But of course, that comes with a limitation, right? And then we have some small tests that we do, like index properties and all those things in the investigation. And we get to know some parameters, including strength parameters, which is, you can say, C value or phi value based on which test you performed and which soil you encountered. That kind of decides which test you will be performing as well. Most of the time within that also we do very basic tests like CU test, UC test, unconfined compression test, you can say, or we do direct shear test. Very rarely you will see that somebody is doing consolidated undrained or consolidated drain test unless it is a big structure and big, I mean, big, very big projects, unless we are getting into that. Now, dynamic analysis is beyond that. And we need to look at also how the soil is going to respond to dynamic, you can say, loading. Now, that is where we have to think about how do we extend that information, what we get from geotechnical investigation, to whatever properties we need for dynamic analysis or dynamic response, you can say, right? But of course, we are not going to discuss how to perform dynamic analysis in this presentation, but having some idea about what are the properties will help in doing some simplified approach as well. So if I look at the stress strain curve, if you look at this curve from origin to top, it looks like a stress strain curve to me, right? And that can become a backbone curve for a dynamic analysis, dynamic response as well, at least for the first cycle in a way. If you go on the opposite side, it may go something like this, which is similar to what you get on positive side, but it may be slightly different, you can say. And when we do cyclic loading, it is going to have, you can say, some response around it. That I will show you in the next slide again. But one thing that you notice here, it's a nonlinear response. And when I look at very small strains, let's say 0.01% or lower, 0.002%, 0.005%, I'm talking about, right? So that kind of range, it may appear to be a linear response between stress and strain. But as we increase the strain level, the response becomes nonlinear. And the nonlinearity is such that the stiffness is reducing. So if I look at the tangent modulus, that means at any point of the curve, if I draw a tangent, the slope of that will be tangent modulus, right? Or it can be secant modulus. So at any point of the curve, if I join it to the origin and take the slope, that will be secant modulus, so G sec. And initial modulus, G naught, is at very small strain where we said the response may be more or less linear. So if I plot this G naught value here on the side curve on the right, and then look at how G secant modulus is changing with different strain levels. So at different strain levels, I take the value of the slope and I get a response that is called, you can say, modulus reduction curve, right? So modulus is reducing with strain level. Now imagine earthquake, right? If it is small acceleration earthquake, or if the soil is capable enough not to deform too much, you can say stiffer soils or denser soils, then that strain level may be very small, in the range of 0.1%, 0.05%. So somewhere here in this range. So I may be still good with assuming G naught or maybe close to that. But when you have softer soils, medium to loose type sandy soils, and or you can say soft to medium dense, medium stiffness type clay soils. So those kind of soils will have, for the same loading, much more deformations. And so earthquake is same. So you can say the excitation that is coming from the source to the site is same, but the soil strata has changed now. So for the softer soil strata, I will have much more deformation. So the modulus is also reducing further in a way. So anyway, G naught was lower for those soils, and then you are further reducing it for non-linearity being developed. But at the same time, it may have some advantage also, and I'll come to that later. So depending on which kind of analysis you are doing, this information will be useful. So for, you can say, nonlinear analysis, if you perform, then you will be taking slope at every point. That will be tangent modulus. And if you perform equivalent linear analysis, so that is to say, I take a modulus at particular strain, assume that value, and then I perform the analysis and check back whether strains are going to be in that range or not. If it is not going to be, then I will change the G value again for with this curve and then perform analysis again. So it's like iterative approach that I will take. So that is what equivalent linear analysis will be. So in that way, I have some complication here because of strain, but it is manageable. The challenge is not that. Challenge is basic. कहते हैं ना, लोचा हमेशा बेसिक में ही होता है, राइट? तो how do you find G itself is a challenge. You can say G naught. This concept is fine. If I find G naught, then how do I find modulus reduction curve? Because we had performed UC test. We had performed, you can say, direct shear test. That doesn't give me this, right? Unless I perform some kind of resonant column test, or you can say cyclic simple shear test, or cyclic triaxial test, or something like those. And that is going to be rare, very rare that you will see that this kind of testing is being done. Now that is where the challenge is. So challenge is not really in the concepts, challenge is in estimation of parameters, and that too representing the whole soil strata, at least for the representative depth, you can say, right? So that is one thing. Now, most of the times when we talk about dynamic analysis, or you can say earthquake response or dynamic response, in whatever sense we talk about anything which has cyclic loading. Now, what does that cyclic loading relate to the curve that we saw on the last slide? So if I perform cyclic loading at different strain levels, what I see is that, of course, the slope is changing. Slope means joining the peak to peak values, right? So if you see this red to blue to dark blue, it is slope is decreasing. But at the same time, the curve is becoming fatter. The cycle is becoming fatter. And fatter means the more energy is getting dissipated in the completing the cycle. So that means more damping in a way. So with more and more strain, what I observe is that modulus is reducing, but damping is increasing, the material damping, right? Whereas G naught was same, G second modulus is changing. If I compare with static response or backbone curve kind of thing, skeleton curve, right? That you see as a black curve here as well. So this basic understanding that I have now, and I can use again the slope of the curve for nonlinear analysis and direct peak to peak value, slope value, that will be second modulus type thing, and that will be used for equivalent linear analysis kind of thing. And for damping ratio, I can find from this curve itself if I have, but again I said rarely you will see that any of these kind of tests are performed, right? So that is where we have to depend on a lot of you can say empiricism many times because we don't have data. It's very expensive and not many people can conduct these kind of tests. It's not that it cannot be done. It can be done, but it's just that it has not come to practice in general level, you can say, because it's complicated to do those tests many times, right? And so some, you can say, ballpark idea about what are those values can be obtained by some empirical or you can say recommended tables. Now this Gmax, there is another way I can find out. I don't need to necessarily perform laboratory test. So what is the other method that is available to me is field test. So in field, I can perform, you can say, geophysical methods, which is like, you may have heard of reflection survey, refraction survey, where we place geophones at certain interval, and we take a hammer and put hammer on the ground, and that generates some mechanical waves. It travels through the ground, and then we measure at geophones, and then that I use for estimating how much time it took for the wave to travel. And from that wave velocity, I can estimate what is the modulus. And of course, these waves are at very, very small strains. So these represents the G naught or G max value in a way, right? So that is one way. And there can be several methods like cross hole method you may have heard of, or uphole method, downhole method. There are several methods, SASW, MASW. All these methods are good for different aspects and they give you G naught value. But G naught was one aspect. I need to get G. And how do I get G? That is the problem, right? And another issue is that where is the damping in it, right? I don't get damping from these tests directly, right? So that's another difficulty, right? So let's look at how these modulus values G naught or G max can change with different aspects. So with overburden or effective stress, it increases. So with depth, it is supposed to increase even if you don't change the density, although density will change because of the overburden, but effective stress itself may have influence. Similarly, if void ratio is decreasing, G naught will be higher, or void ratio is higher means density is lower. So that means G naught will be lower. Similarly, there are several other aspects that influence that G naught value. So it's very difficult to say now a table is good enough to represent that value in a way, right? So that is one difficulty that we face. Now, another aspect to, you can say, Gmax estimation is if I want more precise estimate than a wide range of table, you can say, then I can correlate those with SPT values or CPT values. SPT is standard penetration test, CPT is cone penetration test, right? And I can correlate that if I know void ratio, then maybe I will be more precise. If I know if it is over consolidated, I may be more precise. So the more information I know, maybe I will be more precise in my estimate. But there are, if I look at how many such recommendations are available, that will be more than 50, 60 recommendations of Gmax based on different combinations of SPT and CPT values, right? Now, if I take one geotechnical investigation for a site and perform this analysis. So this is done for Ahmedabad only. You can say this data is from what is that called? Koba Circle, right? Near DPS Gandhinagar, right? So for that soil strata, we had plotted with several recommendations about 10 years back, right? So we looked at how is it varying with, you can say, depth based on these recommendations. What do I see here is a variation of almost 7 times, right? So it varies from almost 50 to 550, 60 to 550 or something like that, right? At the bottom. So how good is this? Now that is another challenge, right? All these correlations are good, but why is this varying so much? Because these correlations have been developed for a limited data based on whatever people found in different research groups for certain sites, you can say, right? And that representative site would be 2 or 3, 4 locations. That's it. And that soil may be very different. So for instance, you have more of alluvial deposits in India, right? Whereas if you take a Japanese data, you will have more of those volcanic type deposits, right? And if you go to UK or US, you may have more of a glacial deposits or residual soils kind of things, right? And they have very different nature in terms of their characteristics and how they respond to SPT versus how do they have shear wave velocity. So stiffness versus strength issue is also there. SPT is fracturing, right? Ground. So that is more of a measure of strength. And that we are trying to correlate with stiffness, and that too stiffness at very, very small strain, which is in a way weird combination because stiffness is not necessarily related with strength, right? A very bad cross correlation between them in a way. So then in that case, what choice did we have? Because we have only limited data. So I have to find a way. Now, if I use these kind of correlations, if I know which will work for Indian subcontinent or for this region, by some, you can say, correlations that are existing between the more comprehensive measurement of G and these correlations, then maybe I can narrow down this variation a little bit, and then I may have more confidence on these empirical relationships. Otherwise, it's almost useless actually. I don't know if I use even average value, that is 3 to 4 times variation possibility. Probability is there. So then how do I handle this? That is the whole question in a way, right? So that is where what I have been saying is don't just depend on these kind of empirical correlations, but do perform geophysical methods. At least you may have 20-30% error, but not at least 300-400% error possibility, right? And there is a lot of hesitation, a lot of resistance to perform geophysical methods because people somehow believe that that is not going to give you any authentic results. But actually, that's maybe true some time back. But today, I think if some knowledgeable person is there, they would know for which strata, which kind of method will work better. So not every method works for every strata. That is what many times people don't know, and that's where the problems happen. You can say in misinterpretation. But in any case, it is better. Now, if I know that, then I still need modulus reduction curve. So if I need modulus reduction curve, I need to perform for that particular soil, I need to perform some kind of, you can say, resonant column test or dynamic simple shear test or something like those things, right? And that is again very difficult, right? Now, well, at least I know G naught. So I will be able to find G if I can have some fair estimate of what kind of modulus reduction curve I can use. So one of the representative, you can say, modulus reduction curve range that I have produced here. And what you see here is for 3 different categories, gravel, sand, and clay. The variation can be maybe 1.5 to 2 times. And I'm purposefully giving you these variations as large variations, right? Because people believe that like you have a strength of steel that may have 5% or 10% variation. The soil estimate maybe have 20-30% variation. If you talk about these G values, G naught values, it can have much more variation. So that's where challenge is in a way. So so I would say if I understand that this kind of variation is possible and it may happen, then I will be able to use them with that caution in my mind, at least, right? So when you use G naught value, remember that that is not the accurate value. That is only a representative value, which may have a lot of variation from it whenever you're using in a project. But of course, for any calculation, you have to use one value in a way. Now, this kind of plot I may still use instead of going for you can say comprehensive geotechnical investigation, because that will become a project itself, and that is not worth spending so much time on that kind of investigation. I may take conservative decisions based on whatever I observe from the estimated G naught value or G value that I will use for analysis. So I hope you got some glimpse of what soil properties mean in terms of modulus, in terms of damping, in terms of modulus reduction, and so on. Some sense of that. For different types of loading, you see earthquake is ranging from almost very, very small strain to very large strain. So it is going almost like 1% strain or maybe more even, right? So depending on the soil strata, the deformations can vary a lot. And that's where G versus G naught relationship becomes very, very important for earthquake analysis. And that is not so much for machine foundations, because machine foundations, we know that deformations will be very small in a particular range, you can say, right? But here we have no choice but to worry about the modulus reduction. Okay, just to show how G versus damping variation happens. So if you look at with strain level, you saw that the slope was reducing for second modulus. So G by G naught is reducing, that is blue curve. And if you look at the cycle, it is becoming fatter and fatter. So that means more energy dissipation, more damping. So damping is increasing in general with gamma. So this is true for most of the soils, but not 100% soils. So some soils show weird response, some other kind, because of some other aspects coming in picture, like the structural changes or pore pressure changes or something like those, right? So they can have influence in these, you can say, curves a little bit, but that is not very common variation. So in general, you will observe that the modulus is reducing with the strain level and damping is increasing with the strain level. So this is just to show with the sand and clay how damping ratio and G by G naught vary with the strain level. Just one example for a soil, you can say. So damping ratio, similarly, the strain value, if it is higher, the damping ratio will be increasing. If effective stress is higher, it may decrease rather. With void ratio increasing means density lower, the damping is lower. And similarly, there are many other aspects which can influence damping ratio. Now, this is one aspect. And another issue that we deal with is volume change in the soils, right? So soils can be contractive or dilative depending on their packing. If the soil is more dense type, then it may be dilative. If it is loose to medium dense, it may be contractive. And if you have water present there, then that will contractive response will lead to positive pore pressure, and that means reduction in effective stress. And what we said is, if effective stress is high, G reduces. Wow. So we had one problem. Now this is on top of that, another problem. We have earthquake loading, which is fast loading. Now, if I have water also, that may increase pore pressure if it is loose to medium dense kind of soil, and that may reduce effective stress. And if it reduces effective stress, then G will further reduce. So whatever you measured, whatever you estimated as G, that may not be sufficient. It may be much lower than that if you have pore pressure building up there. In dilative case, it is just the reverse response, you can say, right? So pore pressure reduces, the effective stress increases, so it becomes stiffer and stiffer with, you can say, pore pressure building in negative direction. So that way, that's not big concern, I would say. But this contractive nature, and that's where if it is extreme case, then it becomes liquefaction that you may have heard of, right? So with very high pore pressure buildup. Now, all these things are going to influence whatever structure you place on the ground. Whether you like it or not, it doesn't care, simply, right? So if you have dry soil, if you have drained loading, you can say, or if loading is very slow, that pore pressure is not a concern, then you may have still, you can say, vibrations on the foundations that you may place, and that may ratchet, you can say, different modes of vibrations that are possible in that under seismic loading, right? Now, they may have continued settlement in each cycle, but of course that settlement will be reducing. And this settlement will be more than the static settlement in general that you would expect under static loading, basically. So static loading is just one cycle, you can say, right? In a way. Now, not one cycle, even half cycle, I would say. Now, when you have undrained condition, then we said if it is compressive in nature or contractive in nature, then you will have pore pressure buildup. And that pore pressure buildup may decrease the effective confinement. And if the total confinement is equals pore pressure, then what will happen? It will reach zero confinement in effective sense. So effective confinement becomes zero in that case. So if that becomes zero, then of course the strength, the stiffness, everything goes to zero. So most of the non-cohesive type soils have this problem of if pore pressure is high, then you can have very low effective stress and they may lose strength completely, and we call it liquefaction, right? But is this the only definition of liquefaction, or is it more to it, or is there more to it? So that is one aspect that we will look into, right? Quickly. But before that, I want to mention one more thing. What does it depend on? So is it only density that it depends on? No. So same 30% or 40% relative density, right? In one sand can say I'm not going to liquefy, right? In another sand, it can say I will liquefy, right? So the methods that you use for estimation of liquefaction, they are for general conditions, but they are not necessarily going to predict every case accurately. So that we have to keep in mind, that we swear by those methods, and those methods may or may not predict well for the liquefaction again. And it is difficult to say whether it is safer side or conservative side or unconservative side many times, right? But of course, some risk is always involved. So whenever we do, you can say factor of safety also, we want to believe that factor of safety too is safe, but there is always a possibility of failure always, right? If we go into probabilistic sense, then there is always a probability of failure. It may be 1%, 2%, but very low, but there is always. So it's like that. So there is some risk involved in any method you use, but that is not the big issue. Issue is that do I know which soils are going to liquefy more than the others, right? So I'll make a couple of points here. One, many of you may have heard of Bhuj earthquake, right? And there's a lot of, you can say, liquefaction that happened in that region. A lot of pictures you will find on the internet from that period, right? Now, when we brought that sand here, one of my colleagues is working on those soils actually. So we saw that they are very unique soils actually. They are highly liquefiable soils. So even if you perform triaxial test, simple pseudostatic triaxial test, right? So if you perform that, even in that, under undrained condition, it comes down like very steep softening. So after reaching peak, it comes down. So residual strength is very, very low for them. And which is not the case for so much for Sabarmati sand, you can say, for Ahmedabad region, right? So that is one aspect that we have to keep in mind. There are certain soils which are highly susceptible, and there are certain soils with even lower density may not liquefy under the same conditions. And that of course depends on the particle shape, size, the nature of interlocking and so on. There are several aspects to it, right? Then one important thing you have to remember is you need water for liquefaction to happen, right? Initial liquefaction to happen. So if there is no water, there is no pore pressure, right? So that we have to keep in mind as well. So there are certain aspects to this which we need to worry about. But is that the only story? No. So I was mentioning that there is another aspect to, you can say, liquefaction. That's where the word that you call liquefaction is actually initial liquefaction. And it is one kind of instability in the soil, which is called pore solid fluid instability or fluid instability, you can say simply, right? Now, there are other possibilities of instabilities that can happen. So if I look at this curve, red curve, which is the test from triaxial test data. So it is a little different from triaxial generally you perform. So when you perform triaxial test, initial condition is isotropic. That means deviatoric or your shear stress is zero in the beginning. Then we apply some loading in axial direction, and that increases shear stress. But in field conditions, you have something called at rest condition. K naught condition, right? So under K naught condition, you have sigma V vertical stress, sigma H horizontal stress, and they are not equal. So sigma V is greater than sigma H. So if sigma V is greater than sigma H, then there is a shear stress acting. No doubt about it, right? So initial condition itself, there is a shear stress existing under K naught condition, and that is what you see as initial point here at this location, right? You can see my pointer, I hope, right? And then if I perform test from there, it will reach a peak and then it may soften and it may become steady state after so much of a strain, or you can say large strains, right? But what is happening here? It is reaching a peak and then becoming unstable in some sense, right? Because most of the natural loading will not be deformation controlled, but rather force controlled, you can say, right? So in a way, it is becoming unstable from here if you talk about structure. But even for soils, there is an instability within that. So there is a possibility of soil not deforming uniformly. So they may deform at one location more than the other. So there's a you can say shear bands or something like those kind of things are forming, cracks or something like that, right? And that you see in the traxial sample sometimes if you observe closely, right? So this kind of response I see from traxial test. If I perform a cyclic traxial test, how would it respond? So what I will see is that with every cycle, the shear strain is increasing in plastic deformations. So there is a permanent deformation that is accumulating with every cycle, right? And at some point, what will happen is it will reach the point where it will simply flow with plastic deformations, because this point here is not stable. So if I am applying force control loading here, stress control loading here, the moment it reaches here, the sample will just deform infinitely, right? The load is more than its capacity, sample's capacity in a way, right? And now this can be classified as instability again, right? Now this is another kind of issue that can happen many times. So strength is not going to zero, but strength is much lower than what I had taken for design. So if strength taken for design is higher than the actual strength of the soil, then what will happen? You will have failure, right? And that's where you, in codes, you will see that we use reduced strength many times. Sometimes you call it residual strength also, right? So that is covering the instabilities of this kind, you can say, right? So even if you do from isotropic condition, you will have under undrained condition, you will have this kind of response. And liquefaction, when you define, is when it reaches here. But what I said is failure can happen way before that. It doesn't need to necessarily reach the liquefaction condition, right? Okay, so if I now move on to some structures, you can say, right? So if I look at the shallow foundations, they can have various modes of failures possibility. They can shake around, they can vertically or horizontally, they can, you can say ratcheting can happen, they can, you can say shake about an axis in some sense. And also the regular failures that you had earlier, excessive settlement or bearing capacity failures, those are also possible because of huge loads coming in a way. Now, all these possibilities are there, and those are happening because there is a wave traveling from the ground. It is now interacting with the foundation, and foundation is supporting a structure above, and that structure will have its own response. And we know that when we talk about dynamic response, it is always the frequency of loading and frequency or natural frequency of the structure, if they have a role to play, you can say. If they match, then you have much more amplification. If they're not matching, you may not have so much of amplification. So that aspect is also there on top of this. So in a way, what you want to make sure is that whatever happens, your foundation is still there. And from that point of view, some guidelines have come up with time. So due to cyclic degradation, those strength degradation that I was talking about, stiffness reducing with the strain, and Also, another degradation that is possible, you can say, which it is referring to here, with every cycle, there is a reduction in stiffness. That is also possible, right? So the bearing capacity that was available for load, that is not available anymore. So strength or stiffness both have reduced with every cycle of loading. You can say there can be stability issues of the foundation, sliding or overturning because of large horizontal inertial forces. And around the foundation, you may have large settlement due to tilting of foundation, or you can say due to moments coming from the building as well. So there is eccentric loading that will develop below the foundation. Softening or failure of the ground due to redistribution of pore pressure, that is also possible. Remember that pore pressure develops according to the shear deformation that happens at different locations. So if shear deformation is uniform throughout, pore pressure buildup will be uniform. If it is not uniform, then it will be different at different locations. So that is another complication that comes in picture in many ways, right? Of course, we cannot handle all of those to 100% accuracy in simple analysis. It will become very complicated, transient finite element analysis kind of thing with time domain analysis, of course, for seismic loading. That will become like a research project, and no project will have that kind of time to perform the analysis. And that's where the codal provisions have to take care of that in some way. Now, for 1893, 2016, we had one update, and that was an update from, I think, 2002 and 2010, and there were several updates before that. And even after 2016, there was a lot of complication within that, and there was a lot of confusion within that. So last year, we had a big exercise of revising 1893. Professor Sudhir Jain was involved as a World Bank initiative, and he was taking lead, and we all chipped in for contribution into the revision of the code. And it is under consideration for BIS to adopt it or not, kind of thing. But most of the recommendations that I'm showing here are well established, so nothing to worry about as such. So what I'm presenting here may not be all approved code. It may be approved after some time, but I'm not sure if there'll be significant variation from this, but there can be. So that is the disclaimer I want to give. So what we define here is 3 types of soils, so that we can have at least some idea about what analysis we are going to do. Type A, type B, type C, and that we are classifying based on SPT values or CPT values or shear wave velocity, whichever is available to you. And that we take as an average for top 30 meter of strata, you can say, from the ground surface up to 30 meter depth. So that average value, weighted average value, we consider, and accordingly we classify as type A, type B, type C, and based on the types of soils, you will decide many other things in the code, including you can say which response vector to use and so on for the building itself. And you may have seen this kind of similar kind of slide earlier in some other presentation as well, maybe, right? From the foundations point of view, let's make it very simple. Earthquakes are, you can say, short-term loading. They are transient loading. And we design structures for maximum earthquake that I may expect for certain period or design period, you can say, or something like that, right? Some return period. So now that probability of occurring or having that earthquake during the design life itself is not very large, very small. Second is duration is very small. Third is that if it is so, then maybe we can allow some deformation to occur if it has to happen. Some damage, if it happens, it's okay. It should not be life-threatening, right? So all these aspects, if I consider, then I can say that I can allow the, you can say, the structure at lower factor of safety, or I can say, since it is for short period, I can have larger allowable bearing pressure. So remember this, if it is transient loading acceleration is happening for a fraction of seconds, or maybe 0.1, 0.2 seconds sometimes, maybe, right? Now, when I convert acceleration to displacement, right, it will be integrated, and that displacement will come out as some finite value. But that force is occurring only for a short period. So what we are designing here most of the time is for force, not for deformation, right? So if we allow that deformation to happen, then that allowable force can be increased. And that is the logic behind, you can say, having this increase in bearing pressure that you can assume for seismic loading considerations. So the IS 1893 allows for this increase depending on the soil type. Now, liquefaction susceptibility is another aspect, and here we are talking about initial liquefaction mainly, right? And there is in the code there is an appendix where it tells you a simplified method of determining whether it is going to liquefy or not. What we are defining here is a few, you can say, guidelines for what you should worry about when you're, or how do you perform the analysis? How do you decide to perform the analysis for liquefaction? So if soil deposit is consisting of loose to medium type, you can say cohesionless soils, or sandy and silty sand, very low silt, I would say, type sands, then I should worry about it if it is underwater, right? If it is not going to be underwater in the design life, I'm not supposed to worry about it, right? Now I have the code will also mention that marine clays, if you have, then you have to worry about it again. So marine clays, what happens is they are sensitive. So if you shake them, they lose strength suddenly, right? So that is similar to what happens in liquefaction in general, what we know, right? So like if you go to the locations near Kandra port, sorry, Adani port, or you can say near south of Dholera and all those regions, right? You may find some of these kind of deposits. And when you have rain happening, they become very, very soft. And similarly, if you have those saturated, and then if shaking happens, they may further lose strength, and they may simply become like a, you can say, swamp, something like that. So what kind of strength I can expect there? Nothing, almost, right? So those are also included in the new proposal, you can say. What it says is, if the following conditions are met, right, then you don't need to worry about liquefaction analysis at all. Otherwise, you have to do liquefaction analysis, liquefaction potential analysis, right? So what are those conditions? If percent passing 75 micron, so fines content, right? ISC is less than 5%, right? So fines content is very small. And N1 corrected, N160 correct, that is SPT value, corrected SPT value is more than 30. So it is very, you can say, strong strata, right? Then you don't need to worry about it. If fines content is between 5 to 15%, which is medium level content of fines, and SPT value is more than 25, so it has been reduced now, right? Then you don't need to worry. Otherwise, you have to worry. If fines content is even more, then SPT value below 21, you have to worry about it in a way. So you can say that there is a fines content and there is a SPT value. Based on that, I can estimate if it is qualifying this, then I don't need to worry about liquefaction. If it is not, then I should perform liquefaction analysis. Now, another aspect that is where common mistakes happen is what is the design water level, right? So we are now defining very clear cut what is design water table, which is the highest water table that can exist at the site over several weeks in a year. So if you go and measure one day, what was the water table, that you should not consider as design water table, right? Rather, over the year, what is the highest level that you would expect, not for one day, but for several weeks? kind of thing, right? Then that will become design water table. Many times we don't pay attention to this. Um, in small projects, it's okay, I would say. But if you do that for bigger projects, it's not fair, really. You are wasting money of people unnecessarily. Because if you you can say overjudge the water table, and or say water table is at the ground level, who is going to pay for it? Actually, if it becomes liquefiable, or there is a remedy needed and so on, there's a cost to project, right, associated with it. So that is where I think estimation of water table is very critical actually in this exercise. Of course, which may be which may be differing from the what water table was reported in the subsurface investigation. That was at one particular time, and most of the time you don't do geotechnical investigation when it is rainy period, right? So you end up with some water table which is lower than what actually it may be in over the year in a way. Okay, so as far as possible, we should avoid liquefiable sites because they are pain to handle, and there is extra cost involved most of the time, and especially in important structures, right? But of course, we cannot avoid all the time, and that's where we have some alternatives. So two alternatives are there. One is I can provide pile foundations, but pile is costly, very expensive. So if you have to spend somebody else's money, you may not care. But if you have to spend your own money, then of course you will care, I think. I hope so. And of course, government money is our money. So we would like to save that money, right? Because that is taxpayers' money in a way. So that's where we have to judge which will work better, whether pile foundations or ground improvement. So what happens with pile foundations? I don't need to worry about, you can say, how much remediation is possible or not. And I don't do any remediation, you can say, or liquefaction may still exist. You can say liquefiable soil may exist as it is, right? So what we do in that case is basically take the pile to deeper strata where liquefiable soil is not there, where it will get its grip. And when liquefaction happens, of course, the strength will be much lower there, almost zero. And there may be some non-liquefiable top layer, which may have some issues as well. So I will have to take care of all those loads, extra loads that may come, or reduction in capacity of the pile that may happen, right? Now, all those things I will discuss briefly later. Other than that, I can have mitigation techniques. So consider some kind of ground improvement by either some kind of compaction, dynamic compaction, or you can say vibro compaction. All those possibilities are there. And what we need to make sure is the SPT value, critical values that we showed on the last slide are exceeded. So then it is, you can say confirmed that the soil will not liquefy anymore, and then I'm happy and fine. Or alternatively, I can provide water path for water to drain out quickly so that pore pressure doesn't build up, right? And that can be done by something like sand columns, stone columns, or PBDs, or those kind of things, right? So that way I can have water coming out as quickly as possible and no pore pressure generation to cause liquefaction. So one way or the other, I have to provide remediation. So as I was mentioning, marine clays, layers and other sensitive clays may also liquefy and undergo excessive settlements. And that comes as a surprise many times because shear strength failures are mostly very sudden failures, right? So just before failure, everything will look fine. And then suddenly it will collapse. Ground improvement techniques can be compaction or vertical drains, as I was mentioning. And feasibility of compaction will depend on soil type, right? So different soil types may need different types of compaction methods to be implemented, right? And if you provide vertical drains like stone columns or PVDs, you would expect that when seismic loading happens, there will be pore pressure buildup, and that pore pressure will dissipate. Water will go out from the vertical drains. So something is coming out of the ground, right? The water is coming out from the ground, right? In a way. So in that case, there will be some settlement, and that settlement we should account for in the overall design. Now, another aspect for shallow foundations. When you have seismic loading with a building at the top, what happens? You have inertia forces developing in the building. And those inertia forces are going to transfer at the base as shear forces or moments. And in the foundation, they will transfer as horizontal force, and moment will cause change in the pattern of vertical forces. So you may end up with some kind of trapezoidal or weird type distribution of base pressure, like it is showing here as arrows, right? Now that is not same as the dead load of the building that we design for in general, right? So I have to worry about this eccentricity of loading now a little bit, right? And we know from our BTech days that most of the eccentric footings I can design in a very simple way, and that is you can say first, if I can find the eccentricity, then I can do some correction for that. So let's say if I have a dead load of Q and a moment of M that I need to worry about, that will cause trapezoidal force distribution below the spread footing that I have. Now, resultant of that trapezoidal distribution is shown here as a big arrow, right? And the distance between the center CG of the foundation and this arrow is what we call as eccentricity. And for that, I can define what would be Q max. So this orange thing is coming from the dead load, Q, or dead load, or you can say seismic load can also increase or decrease Q in a way. So overall vertical load, I should say, right? And this green part, the green circle, what you see part that is coming because of the moment, you can say. So some is reduced here and some is same amount is increased on the other side, right? So Q max, the pressure minimum, pressure maximum that I can estimate from those moment and vertical loads. So one thing that we generally make sure that the eccentricity is less within the middle 1/3, and that we learned in our undergrad itself, that in any gravity type structures or foundations, you try to remain within middle 1/3, right? In general, right? And we can estimate the bearing capacity, etc., for an effective width. So if it is a strip footing, we will say B prime is equal to B minus 2E. That will be the effective width. So considering B prime, now width is less, right, compared to what it was provided actually, right? So now the foundation will be considered of the size B prime and L prime in that case, right? Now in that case, foundation width is less, so bearing capacity may reduce actually, right? So we have to factor in that aspect. Now, so that is called effective area method. So if you have two-way eccentricity, you will reduce in both the directions, B prime and L prime. So 2EY and 2, sorry, this should be EX here. So B minus 2EX and L minus 2EY. So that will be the effective length and effective width. And the bearing capacity will be calculated for this area now, as if this shaded portion does not even exist, that kind of thing, right? So that way I have now smaller size available, although I had provided much larger for bearing capacity calculations, right? So another aspect that you look here on the this slide, that if eccentricity is more than, you can say 1/6 of the width, or you can say 1/3 of the half width, or it is beyond middle 1/3, you can say, right? If it is beyond that, then we may have separation between foundation and soil. So in general, such separation is not permitted, right? Even for pseudo static seismic analysis. So that means I'm converting the dynamic forces to a constant static force, and I'm using that for estimation of design parameters or design calculations, right? In that case also, you may avoid going beyond middle one third. If you are doing dynamic analysis, if you are doing, you can say with inertial effects, analysis with inertial effects, then you may also be experiencing some extreme conditions, which may happen for short duration, right? And for that case, generally different codes may allow certain amount of uplift. So this width of uplift versus the total width, that ratio can go up to one third or maybe sometimes even one half, depending on which code you are referring to, right? That is for dynamic analysis, not for pseudostatic analysis or for static loading. Okay, now that is for bearing capacity. If I want to find settlement, maybe I can use similarly effective area, and that means load is same, foundation size that I will be considering will be smaller, so the intensity will be larger. So settlement that will come out as after calculation will be larger, right? That is for settlement calculation as an average. But if I want to find differential settlements, or if I want to find out how is the distribution in larger foundations and so on, then I may need some kind of, you can say, soil structure analysis kind of thing. And that is where some springs are provided many times. In most of the projects, we don't do this kind of analysis, except in large projects maybe, right? Where you need to find out how much is the settlement and how much is the tilt and so on, those kind of things. And that's where, or you can say, I want to find out how the dynamic response is going to be, in a way, if you are performing dynamic analysis. So under those conditions, you can estimate G values for, you can say, finding the stiffnesses. You can find the stiffness based on the G values of the soil, and that springs is defined based on what mode of vibration that you are looking at, in a way. So there are various possibilities of, you can say, the foundation. So those various modes will have different stiffnesses. So for example, vertical spring, vertical vibration will have vertical spring, right? If you have sliding resistance, then your spring will come actually horizontally, not vertically, right? Kind of thing against sliding. So for rocking, you may have this same thing. What you have here is just the motion is different in a way, right? And so on. Now, for leaky fiber layers, what care I need if I'm providing pile foundations, right? Now, there are two aspects to when liquefaction happens. One is I have loss of strength. Second is that besides that loss of strength, the whole ground is moving slowly, right? After the earthquake because of liquefaction. Due to some sloping ground, or maybe internal layers are in slopes. I mean, maybe at the top it may appear that it is all flat ground, but the second layer is actually sloping, right? And that can happen near rivers, near water bodies. As you know, I mean, any formation will have slope, only then water was confined to that area, right? So after that, if you filled up the river, then you still have that slope below, buried into the ground, or pond you have filled up, right? So that slope of the original ground is still sloping in a way. And if it is saturated, you have a trouble in hiding, you can say, right? So those kind of situations can cause movement of the ground in lateral direction, and that is called lateral spreading of the ground, right? So the codal provision is that a site with an average sloping ground, which is steeper than 5%, 5 degree slope, right? There we have to worry about this lateral spreading in general, right? This is just additional information, but I will talk about this lateral spreading more on the next slide. This is when you do this kind of analysis, the vertical capacity of pile is also reduced. So it is only 20% of the shear strength in liquefiable layers. So vertical capacity may, I mean, sometimes people say 0, but you can consider 20% of the shear strength in that liquefiable layers. Okay, so this is coming from actually Japanese codes, and now we are adopting in the IS 1893 proposed one. It was not there in the earlier one. So this hopefully will get through. So in this case, what we say is, if you are providing pile, there are 3 layers to be identified. One is non-liquefiable layer, second is liquefiable layer, and there is a top non-liquefiable layer. So these 3 distinct layers. And these are not soil layers. I mean, soil layers may be multiple within or not otherwise, right? So these are based on liquefaction analysis, that this depth to this depth, it's liquefiable. Now what is happening is the strength is reduced here in this liquefiable zone. And that is what 20% vertical I was talking about, right? But strength is not so much reduced in this region, top non-liquefiable layer, right? And of course, the grip is coming from the non-liquefiable layer at the bottom. So that is what is supporting or giving support to the pile, right? Now, if you have lateral spreading happening, what will happen? In lateral spreading, the soil will be moving against these piles. And this non-liquefiable layer at the top will also be moving against those piles, right? So then this liquefiable layer has a smaller strength. I don't need to worry about it too much, maybe, right? Although there will be some pressure coming from there. But imagine how much force this can apply, and that will be in passive mode, right? So what we do is we consider for this non-liquefiable layer at the top as a passive resistance acting on the pile as a lateral force. And 30% of the effective vertical stress, so 30% of overburden, we take as horizontal force in the liquefiable layer, which is also significant. Now imagine how much force you are applying in this whole layer up to the depth of liquefaction, right? And that means the pile has to go deeper, and pile has to have very large diameter to take care of any instability, pile instability in this region, right? And that's where pile becomes very expensive solution. And in some projects, we like to make them expensive, then we provide piles. And otherwise, we would like to avoid it actually, frankly, right? And how can we avoid? By doing some kind of ground improvement. So we have to look at both many times. Sometimes ground improvement may not be possible. I don't know, right? Or you may not have time for that. That means there is urgency of implementation kind of thing, right? So in such situations, you may have to go for pile. So sometimes time is more important than the money in a way. So in that case, I'll go for pile for sure. So I have to assess between all these aspects and then decide which way to go. There are some general guidelines further given, and you will see that we need to tie the foundations if we are providing isolated footings. And also in zone 4 and zone 5, which is high earthquake zones, you can say, or high seismic zones. So individual spread footings or pile caps should be interconnected with ties. Tie beam can be provided at either at the footing level or at plinth level. And if foundation is vulnerable to significant differential settlement due to ground shaking, we should avoid them in zone 3, 4, or 5 and make them more, you can say, uniform settlement type foundation design. Just to give you a sense of simplified analysis for this purpose, so we can take beam column elements for the pile and then provide horizontal and vertical springs. And those horizontal and vertical springs can have the stiffnesses corresponding to some guidelines that are given in pile codes, you can say, with respect to subgrade modulus, or we can refer to some other codes if you're referring to that. And loading will be provided according to this, right? Up to that, whatever depth you are providing. So along with this spring, you will have some loading acting. And of course, in liquefiable layers, the springs, horizontal springs may just simply be removed, right? Because there is no resistance in lateral direction almost, right? Even at the top, there may not be resistance available because the top may be moving with the liquefiable layers. So the springs that will be available only for the ground below the depth of liquefaction, maximum depth of liquefaction, right? These are two plots shown just to show the difference between, you can say, pile without pile cap and with pile cap. The boundary conditions are different a little bit. That's all. So the codal provisions that I was referring to for subgrade modulus that I have copy pasted here, that is I think IS 2911 part 1 or part 4. I think I forgot to mention the pile code here, but that is a concrete pile. There is a code of IS, so that is the one it gives you. And similarly for clay soils, it is different criteria. For group of piles, we will have another challenge where multiple piles are placed nearby and the deformation can happen in one direction or the other direction, right? So critically, for critical cases, we may consider either along X direction or Y direction of the building itself, you can say, most of the time. So then I have to provide spring constants also in both the directions. And I can follow the same guidelines what we had seen earlier. But there is a P multiplier, which is, you can say, stiffness reduction has to be provided because the pile in the front may be having resistance different from what pile is there inside, you can say. So piles outside may have different resistance than the pile inside. So they are kind of have some kind of shadow effects and so on, right? So that effect has to be accounted for when you have nearby piles. So that's where some recommendations are there. So we are working on a code for Indian Roads Congress right now, where we will describe all these aspects further, and hopefully it will come out in next 4 or 5 months, 6 months kind of thing. So these P multipliers are used to have the spring reduced. So last leg of the discussion, I hope I'm on time, right? Very good. So earth pressure, you all know, active earth pressure, passive earth pressure cannot be talked about briefly, right? For estimation of earth pressure on a gravity wall or cantilever wall, we classically were using Mononabe-Okabe method, and there are several variations of that people have suggested over time. But still in the codal provisions, mostly it is Mononabe-Okabe method that is used. So here what you see here is besides the vertical weight of the wedge, we have a horizontal inertial component and vertical inertial component, which we provide as a pseudo static force. So it is static force equivalent, you can say, for the seismic shaking. Now, how much would that be? That is another question. But if I know these values, then is it stable or not? So the analysis is quite similar to what you do for Coulomb's method. It is similar, actually. It is no different. It is just that now instead of W, it is 1 minus kV times W plus vector sum of KHW. So the inclined resultant may come like this, right? And with that excitation force, I have to estimate what would be the force earth pressure here. And that will be my earth pressure, active earth pressure with earthquake loading. So analysis is quite similar. There is no difference as such. Similarly, for passive, I can find out, right? So loading is extra, this part. But other than that, everything what we do in general, Coulomb's method of earth pressure theory, it is same thing what you do in this also. Now, before we go further, I want to reflect a little bit on slopes. I mean, my focus is on retaining wall, but I would like to talk about slopes, which are kind of solving the similar problem in a different way. Just to have a sense of what kind of earthquake motions and how they impact the stability, etc. And then we will relate it back to the retaining walls. So if I look at the slope, there is also a wedge here, like we had for the retaining wall, Coulomb's method, right? It's just that there is no wall here, that's all, right? So there is a wedge here. And that is where we apply some horizontal force, some vertical force due to earthquake, and there's a vertical weight of the wedge, you can say. And from the seismic shaking, I have this acceleration in horizontal direction and vertical direction. If I assume this kh is equal to ah by g, so or you can say kh in terms of ah value as g units. So kV will be AV value in G units, you can say, right? So I can apply that directly, but I will be saying in that case that KH is representing the maximum acceleration in some sense, right? Okay, but that is not necessary. I will come back to that. Now, factor of safety. In this case, we consider close to 1 because we want to allow some deformation to occur, right? We can allow if there is accidents, right? Why I'm saying that? So if you take KH is equal to A max, maximum acceleration, peak acceleration, right? Then if you go to factor of safety 1, even there will be no deformation almost, right? According to because the peak acceleration is not exceeding the force that is needed to deform the slope. But if I take KH less than peak seismic acceleration, then corresponding to that, if I find factor of safety, there will be some deformation, and that deformation is acceptable to me. So that is what we are saying in a way, right? So there is some average acceleration that we use, assuming that there will be some deformation. And with that acceleration, we say factor of safety is in the range of 1 to 1.1, right? So I hope it is clear. It's very difficult to know whether it is clear to you or not. But if you have any questions later, please feel free to contact me. Different codes, different countries follow different values for KH. It also depends on what is the frequency of those earthquakes and what level of earthquakes are more prone in that region or not, that kind of thing, and what kind of structures you want to build. That also is going to factor in that. So these are some general guidelines that were classically used. So it is recommendations from 1966, long time back. In India, I think even IS code 1893 is following these guidelines. So which is based on the zone factor Z for different zones 2, 3, 4, 5. We have this Z value defined. Importance factor is for the structure type. Ground amplification factor depends on the soil type, and weight of the sliding mass is weight, of course. So FH by W will be the KH in some sense, right? So these guidelines are available in IS 1893 as well. Okay, now if I want to find, if I allowed some deformation to occur, then I may be interested in finding out how much deformation is going to happen, right? And actually you can find it, right? Approximately at least, right? So for that, I need to first know what kind of earthquake I'm assuming that is going to occur. So if you want to know how much deformation, you need to know what loading you are applying, right? So I cannot go with just zone factor anymore. I need to know the seismic excitation that I'm assuming that will occur on my site, right? So I need to know time history of acceleration, right? Ground motion. Then I need to know the yield strength of soil that is in the slope or embankment, right? And if I take certain, you can say KH value, then what would be the, you can say, sorry. Before that, if I perform dynamic analysis, let's say, right? Then for that seismic loading, I can perform 2D or 3D analysis of the embankment, and I can know how much deformation will occur in a way. But that and that deformation has to be within the limits, you can say, right? But that is a complicated process. Can we have a simpler process that is going to give me approximately the same estimate what or similar estimate what I will get from dynamic analysis? So that is the target in a way. So if I look at the block on a sloping ground, right, I have force that is acting vertically. I can take components of that in normal to slope direction and tangential direction, red, blue and red, right? Now I have KH, which is horizontal. I can take components of that also. And resultant is what I have as blue and red, right? If Fs exceeds the mu(n) value, right? The frictional resistance that is available. What will happen? This block will start moving. If Fs is not exceeding that, then it will not move. Simple. So if factor of safety is greater than 1, no movement. If factor of safety is equal to 1, its impending motion condition is just about to move. But if factor of safety is less than 1, then the force is exceeding the capacity, and then there will be acceleration for that period of accidents, right? The moment that accidents stops, so force reduces, then you will have block stopped. So that is the concept that Newmark used for sliding block analysis. So what they did is for different KH values, they found out that whether this factor of safety is 1 or 2 or 3 or 0.15 or what. So for different KH values for a given slip surface, they found out what is the factor of safety. Very simple analysis, right? And then they said at factor of safety 1, what is the value of KH that is coming out? So in this case, in the curve below, what you see is at KH is equal to 0.2 around factor of safety coming around 1. So that we said as yield acceleration. So the moment KH value reaches KY, the factor of safety is 1. That is what it means. So that means if KH is more than KY, then there will be movement. If KH is less than KY, then there will be no movement. Simple, right? So using that concept, what they did is, let's take the acceleration time history at the ground level, right? Or maybe in some way I can find average acceleration time history for the embankment, right? Or for the slope or for the retaining wall, right? I can find that. Then in that acceleration time history, plot ky is equal to constant line. So that is this line, right? Whenever this acceleration will exceed this line, the force is exceeding the capacity in a way, right? So in this case, it is 3 places where it is happening, right? So if I integrate this area, I reach here, and below this, there will be deceleration. So minus acceleration, you can say, right? So then there's a velocity reducing. And similarly, it will happen here, it will happen here. And if I integrate these areas, I will get displacement, how much displacement is happening. So now I know how much displacement is happening in the block or in the slope, that way, right? So same concept is used for the slopes. So for a given horizontal acceleration, horizontal equivalent acceleration, you can say, I can find out velocity. With deceleration, velocity is reducing, but for positive velocity, there will be positive deformation. So slope is of deformation is still positive. Then it will remain constant. Then again increase will happen, and so on, right? Now for retaining walls, conventionally the the codes use similar approach. So there are 2 ways we can look at that. The slope way, which is to say, I will assume this bottom of the wall of gravity wall or cantilever wall and a wedge going from the end as the rupture plane and use that slope method for this purpose. Same analysis what we did for slope. I will do for this rupture plane, for this whole mass, right? I can perform the same analysis and I'll get how much deformation is going to occur, right? So after deformation, there will be some deformations like this, movement, sliding, or whatever is happening. So according to that, I can estimate. But we had some more experiments done about 20, 30 years back, and people found that this is not the best thing to do in a way, right? But it was difficult to say what else we can do, kind of thing, right? So that is one issue in a way. By the way, another recommendation in the codes is available where they say that if I cut a vertical line here, I hope you can see my pointer. So if I cut a vertical imaginary line here and calculate how much is the dynamic earth pressure here, right? And calculate the stability of this, you can say, or with that static force, I can estimate yield acceleration for this part only. Then maybe I'll be able to do, but usually that is not the best way to do that. That will be good for stability analysis, not for deformation analysis. So deformation analysis is better to be done like this, right? So that is one issue I mentioned earlier, that it is not giving the best results for retaining walls, what we want. And the reason was somewhere hidden. And that's where one of my PhD students was working and graduated last year. And what experimentally they had found, it is not the one wedge that is happening. Actually, it's two wedges that are happening in retaining walls. So gravity wall doesn't have this issue. So gravity wall is like this, right? So there is no issue. When you have cantilever walls, then you have this issue where there are two rupture planes actually, right? So when you have two rupture planes, there will be sliding happening at this plane, outer rupture plane, as well as inner rupture plane. And that will have different equilibrium equations. And that's where we had proposed a double wedge model where you can say sliding happens in this wedge and the soil near the wall becomes part of the wall. But for stability analysis through Coulomb time method, now you have to worry about variation of this red line as well as variation of this or rotation of this blue line. So it's a double work, you can say. And there is a force compatibility, acceleration or velocity compatibility issues as well. So solving all those aspects, we can find solution to this. And what we found is this result matches very well with what we found from FEM, finite element methods in general. So with that, I'm concluding for today. I hope I could do some justice to what you were expecting. And I know there are 1,000 issues you can discuss, but I think I tried my best to bring to you whatever I felt that you may be interested in. And I'll be happy to take any questions today or tomorrow or whenever you have. So Chaitanya, I'm done.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Now, if participants have any question, please, you can ask. Your audio is already unmuted, so you can ask questions. Please. Professor Bansal, are there? Hello.
Sir, they are still muted.
Okay.
Maybe they can type the question if they want in chat box.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. If anyone has any doubt, then you can write in chat box.
But I'm not able to see chat box somehow. It's disabled in my case.
Okay. One moment.
Sir, I'll dictate the question if anyone writes them.
Okay.
Yes, Professor Patil. you can ask question, please. 1 minute, just wait. Yes, please. You can ask me.
Hello, sir.
Yes, yes.
In Bhuj earthquake, normally, as distance for epicenter increases, intensity decreases. But at a particular instant, a particular location, suddenly intensity increases. There may be some reasons. Can you focus why such intensity of earthquake increases?
So I did not cover that aspect. That is site-specific response study and seismic hazard analysis kind of thing. So you're right. I mean, with the distance, the amplitude, or you can say the magnitude of the wave, you can say, not the earthquake I'm talking about, wave. So that reduces because of attenuation, right? But when you get into the soft grounds, right, their frequency may have match with the some of the frequencies that are coming from the earthquake, and if they match, then those frequencies will get accentuated or amplified, right? And because of that, the certain frequencies, the amplitude may be becoming higher at that location. And with buildings and structures, they have their own natural frequency. If that frequency matches the amplified frequencies coming from the earthquake and the buildings frequency, then you will have more much stronger response of the building as well. Now, in that case, of course, you will have higher intensity earthquake felt there in a way. So I think what you are referring to is why damage happened in Ahmedabad and why not so much in Rajkot or Bhuj, right?
Correct.
Yeah, so that is the reason. But best person to answer that would be, I think, Professor CVR Murthy or other speakers who were there. I think they worked on the ground. They looked at the buildings, each building.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
What factor of safety to be considered in case of design of foundation for earthquake point of view?
So with net allowable bearing pressure that you are increasing, right? In a way, you are reducing the factor of safety. So what is happening is, instead of talking about factor of safety, what we are saying is you increase the net allowable bearing pressure. So whatever factor of safety you want to take that. You found net allowable bearing pressure. And the reason we are not talking about factor of safety is because it includes settlement issues. So there are two aspects, sharing and settlement, right? So sharing part has factor of safety, but settlement has permissible settlement. Then we get net allowable bearing pressure. So in the end, instead of talking about factor of safety, what we are saying is just increase the net allowable bearing pressure and that you use. So in a way, indirectly, we are saying that lesser factor of safety for earthquake. How much is it? It's not defined. It's not needed.
Right. Another question by Fanindra Kumar. How to prevent slow failure by earthquakes?
That's another lecture I can give. The biggest enemy in most of the landslides and those things is water. So if you can train water well, you can remedy half of the, you can say, problems in slopes in general, right? That is one. If you are designing embankment or something, dams or something, I think many times it is better to put some kind of geosynthetic interventions, which are flexible and which are providing the tensile, you can say, component to the soil in a bulk manner. So that way they become much more stable against earthquakes as well. And there is a good energy dissipation also that happens in those cases. So that is for the, you can say, man-made slopes in a way. So that is the brief answer I can give right now.
Any more question, please? Yeah.
તમે જે નંબર પર કોલ કરો છો તે હાલમાં નેટવર્ક કવરેજ
Okay. Yeah, you can type your question in chat box, please. By the time I ask our admin professor to unmute you, right? 1 minute.
Sir, they are able to unmute.
They can unmute you. There, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay. Please, if you have any question, dear participants, you can ask, please. I think no more questions. And
Well, they can write me an email if needed.
Yes,
My
yes,
email
yes.
was there in the last slide.
Right, sir. Sure. So you can write your questions to sir in email, and you remain in contact with sir, right? So thank you. Thank you, Amit Prasad sir. It's really a wonderful session, and I think you have covered basic aspects of geotechnical earthquake engineering, and I think all the participants have enjoyed your session. So we wish you that you will continue your support in future also, and thank you once again, sir.
Your wish is my command. So you say anything, how can I say no? That is the point. Right? And it is always my pleasure. So,
Yeah, you are so humble. Thank you, sir. Thank you.